Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation, Online in a Hurry, Creating Open Content to Drive Library Instruction in Changing Times. I am Kate Mercer, and I will be your primary narrator for this, but some of my colleagues have chimed in to talk about their sections.
Before we get into the full presentation, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River.
Hello, my name is Kate Mercer, and I am one of the Science and Engineering librarians at the University of Waterloo. My fellow presenters are Carrie Weaver, a Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design librarian, Rachel Figueredo, an Engineering and Entrepreneurship librarian, and George Lamont, a lecturer in English, Language, and Literature. So today we are going to examine live open learning objects around information literacy and critical appraisal used in science and engineering courses. Specifically, we will be using the examples from first-year science communication courses and some entrepreneurship courses and co-curricular activities. We will also be analyzing lessons learned from crisis point intervention as a catalyst for ongoing iteration, and recognize how to adapt in-person delivery strategies for effective delivery online. So just for a bit of background, the pandemic, the world changed, and so did how we do outreach, engagement, instruction, and research. I know at this point we're all a little bit tired of hearing about this, but I think we can all agree that the first 2 months were chaos. Having to adapt in so many ways so quickly not only meant having to reframe our daily lives, but also a significant part about how we do our jobs as librarians. While we're used to creating one-off instruction, both online and modules, having to redesign so much content so quickly was a real challenge. And I know that seems simplistic, but I think that even when we realized how much work it would be, none of us realized how much time it would take. It was a challenge because we not only had to rethink what we were doing, we had to rethink delivery, outreach, how we were getting integrated in courses. Were we going to get integrated in courses? What were the opportunities that were arising that were unexpected? The reach of the library in general, how people approached information changed. Giving people lasting information. And this was a big part of trying to figure out how to make these open modules. How do we create open, accessible modules that can be reused, that can be adapted, that can be put out there for multiple people to use, even occasionally in multiple institutions? And then how do we promote who we are and what we do in a way that doesn't have that normal personal connection? A lot of the value in what we were normally designing for was that face-to-face interaction with people. I'm here, come visit me, I can help you. It turned into, I'm here, message me on Teams, and we can talk. But that required a lot of different things to navigate, so it was a really interesting experience for all of us.
Hello everyone. This is Carrie Weaver, Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design librarian. I'll be taking over from Kate for just a few minutes to walk you through instructional design, both what it looks like in general and what it looks like when we have to adapt to building things for instruction in a hurry. So typically, when we are trying to move instruction online, we would follow a more standardized instructional design process. But within the context of having to move online in a hurry, in which we were all engaged, it's important to adapt that instructional design process following what's recognized in the field as a rapid development framework. So I'm going to briefly go over what the instructional design process looks like normally and what the rapid development process looks like and how those two things are alike and yet different. So with traditional instructional design, we would begin with our learners analyzing their needs and their existing level of knowledge. After completing that, we would use that information to help develop and refine the content of the learning object that we were planning to make. And after we had settled on the content, we would then go and design the learning object itself using the content that had been informed by the analysis of the learners and their needs. After completing all of those, we would do assessment of the learning objects, which is typically testing with real live users, students, learners. And after we have made any adjustments from doing that assessment, then we would go ahead and implement the learning object with the knowledge that in the future we might go back and improve it if needed, or if things change. Within our rapid development framework, we certainly do not have time to analyze our learners or their needs, and we have to think about assessment quite differently. So in a rapid development framework, we begin with the content itself. We work on developing the content, and we do that independently of the design. But after we have settled on the content, we move on directly to the design of the learning objects. After we've designed the learning objects, we actually don't typically do any assessment. We'll give it a once-over to make sure that we don't have any glaring errors with grammar or problems with functionality. But after that, we'll directly implement the learning objects, and we'll use our live learners to help us iterate and actually functionally do the assessment for us while they're actually using the learning object. So you have to think about how you're going to do the instructional design, the learning design, quite differently in a rapid development context. One of the questions that you might be asking based on that explanation of instructional design versus a rapid development framework is, what exactly is a learning object anyway? Well, IEEE Learning and Technology Standards Committee has given us a really nice definition, which you see here on your screen, but a learning object can take many forms. Often librarians will think of videos first off. Videos are just one example. They can be handouts, PDF documents, interactive modules, infographics, PowerPoint slides, and a whole host of other materials. All of those count as learning objects. They're essentially anything that anyone might use for learning, education, or training in an online context. When working to do instructional design, whether it's under a typical process or a rapid development framework, there are two main areas where you're going to spend the majority of the time. One of those two is content development, and the other is the design itself. So here are a few tips for content development within that rapid development framework. So first, it's really crucial that you focus on presenting only the minimum required information to communicate a concept. And normally I wouldn't read this directly from my slide, but this particular point is so drastically important that I'm actually going to say it a second time. Focus on the minimum required information to communicate a concept. Librarians have a real tendency to try to give their learners everything in the kitchen sink just in case they might need it. And especially in the context of having to do things quite suddenly, nobody has the time or patience for that. Not only that, but it will tend to muddy the waters and make the information much harder for the learner to take in if you don't focus on just the basic and minimum information. The second thing is to really break the content into the discrete, tiny component parts. This makes it much easier to break it apart and reuse it later, or reorganize things if needed, if you get a lot of feedback from your learners after you implement that you need to do that. Finally, it's really crucial, and this is independent of whether it's a rapid development framework or a traditional instructional design approach, that you consider and develop the content completely independent of the design. The content is going to really help you decide what the ultimate form the design will take. And so spending that time up front to focus on the content and make decisions about what the minimum required information is that you need to communicate will really help you make the critical decisions that you need to make about the form that the learning object will take and what kind of function it needs to have for your learner. So obviously, when you're trying to design something, the design itself is quite crucial. A few things to think about if you're in a situation where you're trying to do rapid development of online instruction. A clear and easy layout is really going to be helpful to your learners. Focus on things that are simple. There are all kinds of different learning objects out there, and often people have a tendency to think, oh, I'm going to make a video out of this. Oh, I'm going to make a module out of this, when a simple infographic or a really nice handout that's well organized and thoughtful can be much more impactful to your learners and take quite a bit less time for you to create. So stop and think a little bit more simply and in a more focused way about what is actually needed before you go ahead and just start making things. And finally, recognize that your learners are in a situation with the move to online instruction where they are just using an outrageous number of different softwares and platforms and tools. And it's really important that you choose options that are going to be easy for them to use, that are not going to require them to get additional software or download things, or that are going to feel really intuitive for them to work with. So this often will mean, in the context of libraries, that you're making decisions to use the tools that they're already expected to use within a larger class, or really simple things that might come from, say, the Microsoft Office suite that you could reasonably expect that the students will have, or you know that they'll have access to through your institution.
So we wanted to give a bit of context into the engineering librarian at the University of Waterloo. And at the University of Waterloo, the entrepreneurship librarian supports engineering and then also several entrepreneurship courses and co-curricular programs, specifically providing instruction for a few undergraduate entrepreneurship programs and pitch competitions near the beginning of each term. The fact that the course instructors and program coordinators recognize the library's value in creating well-researched startup ventures is a big win for the library, but it does present a challenge. Many students see the librarian for similar instruction sessions within the same term, and it can be challenging to diversify content, keep it interesting, while also ensuring that students who are seeing for the session for the first time are also getting the foundational knowledge that they need as those who have seen it 2 or 3 times and maybe have different parts of the presentation that are important for them to pay attention to. So when we moved to online instruction in spring 2020, Rachel, the entrepreneurship librarian, was asked to provide her typical market research section in an asynchronous format so students could view it at their leisure. As a result, Rachel created self-guided decks in PowerPoint. While the software used is nothing new or exciting, this transition created some exciting opportunities. For one, these slide decks are designed to build off each other so students who view the slides for an undergraduate course one week and then a pitch competition the next week won't see too much overlap. The slides have integrated choose your own adventure sections that link to a separate set of slides for students who haven't yet seen this on library instruction, which avoids duplicating content for others. Other benefits of the slides is they can be very self-directed. Students are actually receiving point-of-need instruction because they can view the slides when necessary and come back to them if they have questions later. Each deck of slides includes links to videos using a freely available software called Vidyard, which is another Waterloo startup, Rachel created to demonstrate database searching in select tools. Students can very much determine their information needs and choose accordingly, rather than having to sit through a lesson that might be redundant. To give a bit more background on myself, Kate, and what I do as a STEM librarian at Waterloo, I mostly work in engineering, but I also do support earth and environmental sciences. So I'm always trying to deliver content in new ways, either as one-off instruction or as an integrated part of the course. When we moved to online instruction in spring 2020, we were all asked to move everything online really quickly. We had luckily finished most of our communication courses for the semester, so we didn't have to get that online quickly. But personally, I still had some engineering capstone critique sessions, a few guest lectures, and finally engineering capstone final exams, which were partially synchronous and partially asynchronous. We also did see the writing on the wall and knew that we would not be going back in person, so I knew that I had to quickly design certain courses, specifically the engineering and science communication courses, in an asynchronous way that could be delivered online for the summer and fall semester rapidly. So what I did is part of my work was designing some self-guided slide decks and PowerPoints, similar to what Rachel did. And what these were used for was for more of the upper level classes, thinking that they would have the content, it would be delivered to them in a point of need way, and then the slide decks themselves would be very adaptable depending on which course it was. They were very much plug and play in their intent in designing them. I could put things in and take things out depending on what level of instruction I knew the courses had had in the past, what I knew the students didn't have, what I thought they would need for a course. But the resources, some of the information remained the same, which would save me time. I knew that one of the benefits to this was that because you can kind of edit the audio, I knew that I wouldn't have to re-record everything, which ultimately would save me a lot of time. For the first year communication courses, what I knew I wanted to do was use Articulate, a software that I did have past experience with, but it had been a few years. And what I wanted to do was really take this time to rethink my approach to the courses. I wanted to understand, what did the students like about my lectures? What did they kind of maybe not pay as much attention to? Was this an opportunity to design the modules in a way that would really engage them with topics that I really wanted them to engage with? I also had the opportunity to teach in classes I hadn't had before, and to be honest, this would have been a bit more of a struggle to get things done in time if I hadn't already created some modules or PowerPoints that were that plug and play content. So this gave me a lot of opportunities for outreach and ultimately was a really beneficial experience. So first year engineering and science students at Waterloo take a communication class. Some of these are run by the department, and again, some of these are run by English and communication arts. So in these, the library does come in for a guest lecture, and while I was designing the course that would be kind of brought out to all of these, one of the big challenges I had that I really wanted to focus in on is I wanted to mimic the interactive nature of the in-person sessions. Specifically, a big part of the courses are that we have the students talk to each other about the content. It's less of a lecture and more of a conversation. And that style of teaching was really important to me in how we built the modules. So what we ultimately did is I created an Articulate module that allowed for interactive elements using video, audio, and different visual cues to engage students in different ways. One of the interesting things I found in this is I wasn't sure how students would reply to it. It's a very different thing. What I will say is that a lot of the students really appreciated that the module wasn't another PowerPoint deck because they liked that it broke up their classes. They had screen fatigue. They were tired of sitting there and listening to lectures. One of the things we found that after, of course, we had done a bunch of modules is that students would play them at 3 to 5 times the speed. And so what are they getting? What are they missing? With the modules, that kind of forced them to slow down and be patient with them. So ultimately, that was a really good thing. So I wanted to talk a bit about the lasting value of the modules that we eventually did create. Our goal was to create the online objects with purpose, and that purpose was that we could reuse them in future semesters beyond the initial intent. We all know that a lot of our slides that we create, a lot of our presentations, they're reused different course to course, and we wanted that same framework to be able to guide the asynchronous content that we created. For example, the modules that we created for the communication classes, they can easily be adapted no matter the discipline. We have a separate set for STEM and a separate set for social sciences and humanities, but the STEM ones let us customize them. Is it a biology specific class? Is it a health class? Is it an engineering class? Which section of engineering is it? Are there different resources? By creating the content that was open and flexible, we were able to really design something that could be iterated, that we could easily adapt, that could be used in multiple contexts with multiple people. And what this gave us was a sense of organization that was a really important thing for us to have.
Hi, it's George Lamont here. Part of the challenge with this project is getting the online teaching seamlessly into online classes where it's needed. As one of the instructors who deployed this module in classes and coordinated that deployment with other instructors, I'd like to talk a little bit about the practical issues. We needed this module to be easy to deploy, but also flexible enough to suit individual instructors on relatively short notice.
At this point in the presentation, we'd like to take a few moments to look at some samples of some live learning objects. So to find the learning objects that we will be talking about, you will want to go to the University of Waterloo Online Learning Object Repository, which is the library's repository for all of our available to the public online learning objects. So we're going to examine two learning objects today. The first is an infographic that was created for the purpose of use in these and many classes on critical appraisal in the STEM disciplines. So you can see that we've tried to make it static so that it's readily available to students who may have difficulties accessing things online, limited internet bandwidth, and we've tried to get it down to the most essential information on the topic. This is also something that can be widely shared, emailed, used to address reference questions in other contexts, and can be downloaded so that people have a copy they can reference, which was important. We also did a number of module items, so a related item is this radar framework, evaluating information with radar set of modules. So you can see that we actually walk you through the different criteria with information, and this actually served as the basis for a number of modules that we built for different disciplines with different foci on evaluating information, primarily using the radar framework. So these are a bit more interactive and give students the opportunity to actually engage, if not with one another, at least with the content through asking some of these questions to check for understanding. All of these materials and more can once again be accessed at the University of Waterloo Library's Online Learning Object Repository.
Let's put this in context of numbers first. This module is in over 50 sections of STEM communication courses. That means dozens of instructors needed online conversion on short notice. Flexible structure is necessary in a sudden transition online because instructors are already conducting lessons developed over years of classroom instruction. A highly linear lesson would have led to negative outcomes, such as dozens of individual instructors rebuilding their lessons to suit the module, which could have caused some instructors to drop it entirely or be overwhelmed by the urgent design process. Alternatively, the librarians would have needed to revise the lesson on short notice for dozens of versions, which just wasn't sustainable. So we talked about how to optimize the process and then decided upon swappable handouts and then connections to external activities and assessments. So as you can see on the screen, the module has removable and replaceable activities for situations that required them in individual sections. Then, we worked with instructors to help them plan their own activities that build upon and proceed from the module. Here you see my own LMS page from my course last term. I used my own tweaked version of the Vadar worksheet because that suited me and I had the freedom to do it. Then I connected this to additional activities and drop boxes, and there are even more of them on the screen. So the idea here is building in a module that can be swapped and changed easily and then allows the instructor to proceed from it rather than treat it as its own linear object. We then worked to help my instructor colleagues know about the module and its attributes and understand how to deploy it with the needed flexibility. We then arranged online learning assistants to help instructors install the elements in their learning management systems quickly and easily. Without that department level coordination, we couldn't have achieved the consistency that we did in such a short time. And this is a good reason why library support and critical appraisal should be considered at the program or department level, not only at the instructor level. Information literacy and critical appraisal instruction are also susceptible to student disengagement when the delivery relies on passive learning. Especially in online instruction, in which it's more difficult to assess how students are engaging with the lesson, we needed to develop simple, low-stakes student products that would allow students to demonstrate and instructors to observe learning. To accomplish that, the module contains a module-specific activity that comes in the box, so to speak, without the need for an instructor to create an activity. This is the radar worksheet that you see on the screen. It ties to the lesson, and the instructor can simply collect it to see evidence of the student's engagement with critical appraisal. But instructors had the option to build upon the module-specific activity with a course-specific activity. Here you see a part of my own course-specific activities, in which I require the students to apply the radar approach to a project that they'll do in my course. By prompting the students to apply critical appraisal right after the lesson to their own interests, we activate personal engagement and catalyze the student's own active critical appraisal practice associated with their own interests. And we'd like to speak briefly about the ability to connect critical appraisal durably to a culture of evaluating information critically despite the sudden move online. And we believe that these connections have implications far beyond pandemic pedagogy for how we connect critical appraisal to a course. One issue instructors often face is that once the so-called library session is over, students stop thinking about critical appraisal. We're seeing submissions with no sources, or based on single blogs, and so on. So how can we carry critical appraisal beyond the so-called library lesson? Here's just an example that we use in the communication courses at our university. When we ask students to pitch their own projects, we require them to do the same exercise that they did in the lesson. Many of them have already done it. The connection is seamless, and it allows us to ingrain the practice of critical appraisal into the course itself in observable ways. When the students write a progress report, we require an annotated bibliography, but not just any annotated bibliography. By incorporating the principles of critical appraisal into how we frame and grade the annotated bibliography, students ingrain the practice further. They learn to scale it up for more sources, and they begin to get faster at it. If they still struggle, the instructor can intervene before the final project in the course. We require students to evaluate all their sources in their final project, usually a proposal or recommendation report. The trick here is scalability. The more sources, the more laborious it is for students to write critical evaluations. But after 3 iterations, they're also better at spotting the key issues and focusing on them in commentary. The first radar worksheet was lengthy. Now each evaluation is brief, but incisive and effective. By building it into the course and evaluation, we cultivate it as a durable practice. But the biggest picture here for our presentation, I think, at this part, is that students are doing all of this even though we only see them through screens and interact through email and learning management systems. In many ways, this online approach, which required us to establish clearer student deliverables to compensate for the lack of in-class observation, is much better than what we were achieving in the classroom.
So what were our ultimate lessons learned about rapidly moving courses online? I think one of the big ones, I mentioned it earlier, is that students really did like this module, plug and play, choose your own adventure style of learning. It broke things up. Students and everyone is fatigued, but specifically they kept talking about how they miss talking to people. And while the module does not solve talking to people, what it did do is it gave them a different way of interacting with information. Making these tools, the presentations, is very much a double-edged sword. On one hand, being able to reuse content to the level that we weren't before was a phenomenal lesson. The problem with that is, and I'm sure you've all felt this, is every time we went back to the module, we found something we wanted to change. It's a great way to check yourself when you're delivering content because you actually get the opportunity to read through it and see what you liked about it, get changes. About the changes, though, I found that it was more difficult to get feedback from students this year than in past years. And part of that is just students are tired. Students don't have capacity. We don't have that ability to take those cues that we would normally get from class. You know, who's smiling, who's paying attention, do they come up and ask us questions? Which kind of ultimately the lesson learned is losing face-to-face is really hard. And I know I didn't realize how much I depended on having kind of an idea of the content. I'm also a lecturer, and so I have very well planned out courses. I know I practice my lectures, but I didn't realize how much I kind of use my time, or plan my time rather, for sidebar conversations, for leaving it open for questions. So what the modules forced us to do was kind of preemptively figure out what the questions were, figure out what they could be. What do we want to make sure we tell them just in case they ask? What are we going to leave out and hope that they reach out to us for? So all of this was kind of an exercise in knowing your audience, but also understanding how to engage your audience without actually being able to engage your audience. It was a good experience ultimately, I think, but the number one lesson learned really is choose your content wisely and don't be afraid to iterate. So I wanted to talk about what really did work for the modules and for the slide decks. And one of those things is sincerity. I was surprised with how many students reached out to me and said that they really appreciated the content that was in the slide decks, that was in the modules, and they could tell that we'd put a lot of work into making it accessible and easy to understand and engaging for them. What works is flexibility. Having to think on the fly was a really good way for me to remember to be flexible in the content I delivered. There were some things that I really wanted to include in the Articulate module at the beginning that I just couldn't. It wasn't feasible for what the software, the platform could do. This kind of leads into adaptability. Challenging myself to think about how I adapted my lessons was a really important thing, and I know that when Rachel talked about it, that was a really key thing too. But the other side of adaptability is also how do we create something that's adaptable? What can we really do, not to get comfortable and reuse the same thing 80 times, but how can we create something that's open, accessible, adaptable, and really will serve us well for at least the near future and absolutely longer? And this goes back to scaling things. While we do have a lot of collaboration at Waterloo Library, one of the things that we don't always have is complete consistency. We have academic freedom. We're allowed to do our presentations how we want. We try and keep the general content similar, but we design courses based on who we are as instructors and our users. We deliver lectures in different ways. And one of the things that worked about this is that by building this kind of baseline content that could be scaled to different courses, to different subjects, to different areas, to different people, could also be scaled with different librarians. The content could be shuffled around. The content could be changed a bit. The content could be scaled up or down depending on what each librarian wanted to do. And then finally, what worked is clarity. By looking at our own work and being able to have that feedback with both ourselves and our colleagues, I think ultimately we came up with a product that had a lot of clarity on what the ultimate message we wanted to deliver was and how we wanted people to see the library and the librarians as a member of their team, someone on their side to help them do the best they can, both in instruction, but also as learners. So along with what did work, what didn't work? Being married to content. Like I kind of talked about in what works, I had to let a lot of stuff go. I know Rachel did. There was some content that just couldn't easily transition to online. I will say we've been really successful in getting that up and running the more time we've had. But in a rapid way, we all had to figure out what content was the most important for us to get online first and quickest. And again, this goes into speed. Having to do things that fast, you always end up with some errors. So we had to learn to be very kind to ourselves and that it's okay. We got it online and we got something online. It might not have been perfect with regards to instructional design the first round, but we had a product that we could iterate. The time. I had worked with Articulate before in my corporate position prior to being at the library, and I knew it took a lot of time, but I forgot just how much time it can take. And that's for me who wasn't learning it from scratch, but who hadn't necessarily used it in the recent memory. So it was a really interesting challenge to figure out how much time did it take to do this stuff, connections. And this is a bit of one that I don't really like putting this on what didn't work, because we had some really fantastic partnerships with instructors emerge from this that we didn't have before. We strengthened the majority of the connections we had. I think that everybody really did come together. But what we did lose was that in-person connection with students. So we've been really lucky that at Waterloo we use Teams, and students kind of take that instant messaging thing and seem to feel really comfortable reaching out to us. So we have a lot of good feedback from courses there. But it's a different thing when you're kind of a real person that sees them in their classroom and talks to them, and you have that after-class moment where you can build those connections with them as people, as learners, and that face-to-face thing. And I put on accuracy and perfection on here, not because I wanted to sound too negative about them, but when I finished my PhD dissertation, someone told me, never look at your dissertation. The first thing you'll see is every spelling mistake. And I feel exactly that way about the content that I put on Articulate. The second it was posted to a class, I would look at it and I would be like, yep, there's that one spelling mistake. And this goes back to being a perfection. You have to let go of being a perfectionist for stuff like this. It's not that good enough, anything up is good enough. It's that you need to understand that when you're getting content up in a hurry, getting the content up means a lot. It means a lot to you instructor colleagues, faculty colleagues, that you're working right along with them to get this up and running. It means a lot to students that you're trying to create content and do outreach to them. So all of this stuff didn't work, but not to sound too negative about any of them, because there were upsides to each of these.